All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, a new report is out from the New York Times detailing a plot that bears all the potential hallmarks of a political hit job orchestrated by the federal government and covered up by law enforcement. Let me explain. So last summer, we brought you all the troubling details of the killing of Antifa activist William Reinhoel by U.S. Marshals Task Force. Now, Reinhoel was a common presence at protests in Portland, Oregon, was wanted for his involvement in the shooting death of a right-wing activist with that Patriot Prayer group. Video from the scene appears to show Mr. Reinhoel shooting that activist. He claimed in an interview with Vice that his actions were in self-defense. On September 3rd, a task force that was made up of local law enforcement deputized as federal marshals. They arrived in a residential neighborhood in Lacey, Washington to apprehend Mr. Reinhoel. As he exited a friend's apartment and got into his car, those marshals blocked him in with their silver SUVs and unleashed a barrage of gunfire. His Volkswagen was riddled with bullets. After he exited the vehicle and tried to flee, more shots were fired, killing him after 15 seconds of wild gunfire. Now, immediately after that incident, conflicting reports emerged. One of the departments that was involved said Reinhoel was shot while fleeing and did not mention a gun at all. Another claimed that they only shot him when he produced a firearm. Conflicting eyewitness accounts added fuel to the fire, although every bystander present agreed that they heard no warning or shouted commands from law enforcement before the area surrounding that apartment complex, where an 8-year-old was riding his bike, was turned into a war zone. One of those bullets narrowly missed that child. Another errant bullet ended up in a resident's dining room, narrowly missing his brother. In the final tally, 40 bullets were fired. Authorities have not said how many times Mr. Reinhoel himself was shot. Piecing together exactly what happened has been challenging because none of the officers involved were wearing body cameras. None of the law enforcement vehicles involved were equipped with cameras. President Trump, of course, had his own take on what happened here. Hours before Reinhoel's death, he had urged law enforcement to, quote, do your job and do it fast. 15 seconds fast enough for you, sir. After Reinhoel was dead, he celebrated that killing at rallies in an interview with Judge Jeanine that sure sounded like he was endorsing an extrajudicial political assassination.
It was a lot. It was a religious hat.
Right.
And he shot him cold blood. 2.5 days went by, and I put out, when are you going to go get him? And the U.S. Marshals went in to get him.
Good.
And in a short period of time, they ended in a gunfight. This guy was a violent criminal.
A lot of them out there.
And the U.S. Marshals killed him. And I will tell you something, that's the way it has to be. There has to be retribution when you have crime like this.
There has to be retribution. Attorney General Bill Barr also put out a statement celebrating Reinhoel's death. Local law enforcement launched their own investigation that they claim would get to the bottom of what actually happened here. Was it, as Trump said, retribution, or was it an attempt to apprehend a suspect peacefully that went sideways when the U.S. Marshals were forced to defend themselves against incoming gunfire? Now, that investigation has only raised even more questions about the events of that day and also a potential cover-up thereafter. So here's the New York Times. Police say an Antifa activist likely shot at officers. His gun suggests otherwise. The official police investigation concluded that Reinhoel fired at officers, which would, of course, have justified all of their 40 bullets. According to the Times, the police essentially based their entire conclusion on the presence of one single bullet casing that was in the back seat of Reinhoel's car and some very thin eyewitness accounts from an 8-year-old kid who actually changed his story, one person who did not see Reinhoel fire a gun, and another one who was not certain. Although police claim to have found that single bullet casing, no actual bullet matching Reinhoel's gun was ever found at the scene. When he died, that gun, it was still in his pocket, and it still had a full magazine, indicating that the weapon had never, in fact, been discharged. As an explanation of this pretty hard proof that the activist was killed without firing at officers, they offered this tortured explanation. Lieutenant Simper said it was possible that Mr. Reinhoel had loaded an extra round in the chamber before firing and that the gun had malfunctioned and failed to load a round from the magazine after he took a shot. In addition, none of the officers on the scene said that Reinhoel fired at them. None of the officers said that. And only one even said that he lifted something that may have been a gun. All of the bullet holes in his car, they were all inward bound. Now, the officers had another improbable explanation for this state of affairs, which is that perhaps Reinhoel fired the gun out of an open passenger side window in the car. So now you tell me, based on those facts, Do you think it's more likely that a gun with a full magazine found in Reinhoel's pocket with no bullets ever located at the scene that no officer ever saw raised was never fired? Or do you think it's more possible that Reinhoel loaded an extra round and it malfunctioned and it was fired from the passenger side and they just happened to not find any bullets and every officer on the scene just happened to not see him firing it, along with every single witness save an 8-year-old kid? Now, a lawyer for Reinhoel's family made it pretty plain, telling the New York Times that in his view, they're covering for themselves. The physical evidence does not support what they are saying. Now look, you may hate Antifa. You may think Mr. Reinhoel was a murderer. I'm not a big fan myself. But understand that the potential implications of these events should chill you to your core. I wish I could say this kind of thing was un-American, but unfortunately, it has echoes of some extraordinarily shameful parts of American history. Put Mr. Reinhoel's politics aside. Are you comfortable with targeted political assassinations backed by the highest levels of government and covered up by complicit local police? Because between the comments of Trump and the events of the day and the potential cover-up after the fact, something approaching that appears to be in the realm of possibility. It appears those who were close to the right-wing activist who was shot by Mr. Reinhoel, they're not comfortable with it. A friend of that slain right-wing activist, himself a Trump supporter and member of that Patriot Prayer group, he was enraged at how Reinhoel's apprehension was handled, telling ProPublica that they were not looking for revenge, they just wanted justice. They just wanted accountability. Quote, "We wanted to see him face a jury. We wanted to see him suffer in prison. I wanted to see him answer for what he had done in a courtroom. Those who actually wanted justice will never have that chance. Reinhoel will never have the chance to tell his side of the story. And this is what a police state looks like. It's not actually about law and order or justice fairly applied. It's about crushing punishment for some and total deadly impunity for others. And by the way, Trump being out of office now, that should give you zero comfort. Because if there is one thing I know, it's that whatever power gets away with is sure to be repeated." And Sagar, we covered this story at the time.
Yeah.
And immediately there were conflicting accounts from the eyewitnesses and even from the police themselves, because this was different jurisdictions that came together and were deputized as U.S. federal marshals. And some of them had one story and some of them had a different story from the beginning, which caused a real question mark. And then the way Trump talked about it only added fuel to that fire. This follow-up investigation only creates more concerns and is deeply troubling in terms of what actually happened here.
Trump is a narcissist. I even said this at the time. Or no, an arsonist, really, at the time. And that's why his calls for law and order were incredibly hollow, as we said. This is part of the problem, which is that it got politicized completely all the way around. And I love that quote from the person of the family of the slain. They're like, this isn't what you want. You want to see them face a jury.
Right.
I mean, look, I think the guy was pretty clearly a murderer, and he basically admitted to it on camera. But that doesn't mean that he should have been gunned down by police. I mean, and if you look at that report, look, clearly something fishy going on. And as you said, this stuff repeats itself all the way along down the chain. Go look at Waco, okay? You want to talk about inward bullets and all of that? And actually now the person who was in charge is now the ATF director, which I find particularly chilling, and maybe we should do a whole other segment on that. This repeats itself. They're going to cover it up, and if you don't have political pressure from left or right, then you're just not going to have see any real consequences. And unfortunately, I think that's really where things are headed, because on this case, look, a lot of the left, they're very animated about Mr. Reinhold. A lot of the right is very animated like Kyle Rittenhouse or whatever. And then it becomes people selectively speak out on one thing and they selectively don't say nothing on the other thing. People start, everybody's real concerned about January 6th with a bunch of riots right now in Minnesota, and there's mum's the word from everybody. You have to really just be consistent on this stuff. And if you're not consistent, you're a hypocrite. And then hypocritical selective coverage only leads to hypocritical and selective accountability whenever your side is in charge. And what happens? Power amasses more within the federal government, because the Biden people or the Biden FBI, Biden ATF, they can get away with all kinds of stuff against somebody. And the Trump people, same thing from the right. Everybody's real concerned about Ashley Babbitt at the Capitol all of a sudden, right? On the right. Now they're all they look like BLM conspiracy theorists in the way they're oh, well, she didn't do this and all of that. I'm shut up. You don't actually care. And it's the same way around. So, that's
how tribal politics that is divorced from any principle,
right,
and it's just about cheering your side. That's the type of destruction that it ultimately brings to the country, because, you only care when it's applied to the people that happen to align somewhat with your team, and you just totally erase anything that's going on the other side. And I understand the instinct, especially when so many people have been convinced that politics are existential, that if the other team gets into power, then the country's basically over, right? And so any little bit of comfort that you give to their talking points, you feel like you're taking a loss on your side. And again, especially when you've been convinced that the stakes are so incredibly high. But what you are ultimately doing when you buy into that type of politics is you're just allowing total impunity from anyone who has power, who happens to even nominally be associated with your side of the political fence. That's a scary place to be. And so that's why I think this story is important. And like you said, I really thought the quote from the friend of that slain activist was so critical here. Even if you think Reinhoel's a murderer, which again, look, he's on video shooting this guy. He doesn't really deny it. He says it was in self-defense, and he should have had the chance to make that case in court.
Sure.
But look, even if you think he's a murderer, even if you hate his politics, all of that, like, this is not justice. This is not what you want in your criminal justice system, where you can just have extrajudicial killings. They're covered up by people who are complicit, if that is indeed what happened here, and that everyone can just walk away and get away with it. That's a scary state of affairs.
It really is.
All right, Sagar, looking forward to your radar. That's next.